we interrupt this program.
While I censored a few things in this video, the one thing I didn't censor was the use of the word mulatto or any of those variants like quadroon, octoroon, because quite frankly, I think they are necessary for the sake of the conversation. And while these words are derogatory, I did not feel like it was effective to constantly check them the entire time. I also realized I didn't actually break down sort of like octoroon, quadroon, mulatto throughout this video. And while I can see an argument for doing that, and so I will just put it over here on the screen, the reason I didn't do that is because these terms are not real. They are the worst parts of the social construction of race under white supremacy and have nothing really to do with the realities of how Black people or people with Black ancestry would likely categorize themselves if they had full autonomy to decide their own identities, and very likely pushes people to a more this or that mentality than anything else. So that was intentionally not kept in, but for the sake of clarity, I'm clarifying it right here. So yeah, don't call yourself those things unironically, unless you're like Zayday Smith or something, then, you know, you can make a really good essay about it and pull it off. But I hope you enjoyed this video. It is definitely a little bit different. This video and my next video for March are going to be a little bit more esoteric, I guess, or just, they're going to be a little bit different. But I hope that you will join me on this journey, especially because this is over an hour long. But thank you, enjoy, and yeah, this is also protecting me because I do say bitch from the South in the first 10 seconds of this video, and I was just like, I should probably move that further down.
1/8 Black.
Afternoon, my octoroon. Come on, bring it in there. Tuck that.
In 2019, Bitch from the South was released by the female rapper then known as Mulatto.
Is you gon' catch it? Eat it up for breakfast.
The song was a hit, got an even bigger remix, and then the fledgling female rapper was seen as a true rising star in the genre. Hits kept on coming, and as of 2026, they are certainly one of the more successful female rappers in the game, and I like quite a bit of her music. Also, the Thoughtbox remix, thank you very much for that. But one thing many people kept asking then was, she's gonna change that name, right? Now known as Latto or Big Latto, the Atlanta rapper was born Alyssa Michelle Stevens to a white mother and an African-American father. She stated in an interview that when she was a teenager, she was bullied for being light-skinned and that she referred to herself as being biracial or a mulatto.
Okay, but did you identify as Black or mixed or what exactly?
I don't like identifying with anything like specific. I rather, if I have to be something, I would say I'm biracial, mulatto. I don't like saying I'm white or Black.
I am not coming for Latto, by the way. She was a teenager at the time of this initial interview, and I don't think most people are truly aware of the racial historical identity that they talk about online, even if it is their own, regardless of what their parental breakdown is. We sometimes have this idea that knowledge is passed on simply by genetics, and if this was the case, we would be genuinely smarter as a species, but we are not. So have grace for everyone who is young and learning, who is choosing to learn. But I think her response in this interview about a historically derogatory word that she was very ready to claim as her own rap name is interesting. Because in a world where colorism, featureism, Black identity, and Blackness as an enterprise all intersect in the American landscape, it sort of makes sense that there might be someone attempting to reclaim this term, but still not know what it stands for beyond a basic definition. Because the tragic mulatto is not just a stock character, it is this living contradiction about the politics of race in the Americas. A character of sympathy, but also tragedy that first started before the abolition of slavery in the Americas, but continued due to the narratives around passing into popular books and film. At the same time, these narratives are overwhelmingly used as an examination of whiteness, removing the reality of mixed race identity and transforming it into a Greek tragedy for an audience of white people.
You, it's 'cause you're Black. You make me black.
This is a subject I first intended to cover last year, but it didn't work out because 2025 was really coming for my neck emotionally. I think it shows in some of the videos. But it has remained a subject of great interest to me, especially when Ryan Coogler helped me and Sinners initially came out, which we will get into in this video. Black identity is a topic that is both fascinating and at times frustrating because there is not one universal language around it. What it means to be Black does vary from place to place, and that is intentional and socially constructed. I see Mariah Carey as Black because I'm from America and I've known her to be Black my whole life. But then I had a professor from Kenya that explained that at the very beginning of coming to America, she did not see Mariah Carey as a Black woman. And that was one of the first times I actually dealt with the dynamic of race from a diasporic standpoint, because even as someone of Caribbean ancestry, we also have mixed race people, Bob Marley, for example. So it's not exactly an odd thing, but Bob Marley may be mixed, but is that how he is perceived? Is that how he navigates his life? And what does that mean in a society where mixed race was allowed to be a thing versus a place like America where we are still sort of discovering and trying to figure out how mixed race identity fits into Blackness specifically? We also have a lot of people online who like to say a lot of things that seem like they make sense but are historically ignorant. I have been frustrated about a lot of things concerning this topic for a while, and I wanted to, at this tail end of Black History Month, deliver something hopefully that is educational, humorous, and bridge building, because I like to be right, but I also like to inform people. And this is going to be a more source-heavy video. Everything I'm talking about is based off of books and academic articles I've been reading for over a year. So I will have all the sources down below, in part because I like to do that. But also, when you are American and Black, people like to assume you don't know what you're talking about. So fuck you. I always know what I'm talking about because I research everything. I am constantly fighting the Black urge, the Black female urge to get another degree. But I have a master's. I've been studying this subject for over 10 years, and I really wanted to do something that I felt would bridge a lot of gaps that I see happening online. And at least, while they will not entirely fix anything, I hope it's useful. And I really credit Julesy, who doesn't know I'm saying this, but I really credit Julesy as being someone who helped curate my ability to want to discuss these things and really uplifts me. She is one of my personal inspiration and heroes, and she is someone who has done amazing work in helping to triangulate things. Same with T Noir, Khadijah, who is just holding it down as a Black non-binary creator and just doing fantastic work. I also want to take this time to kind of shout out all the other Black creators I've been enjoying across other platforms. There's Ruthella, who is an amazing makeup artist on TikTok, who is just completely hilarious and just has some of the most amazing looks and sharing these great stories. There's also Wicked Confections. They've been doing this amazing series all Black History Month talking about lost recipes within Black American cooking traditions, and it has been so, what a beautiful way of bringing cultural anthropology and cooking to a place like TikTok that does not deserve it, but she deserves all of her flowers. She's absolutely brilliant. I also want to shout out FD Signifier, Foreign Man, Cat Black, Joe Johnson in the Magic the Gathering community, who has been doing such amazing work in bringing more diversity and just Black pathos to Magic. I'm so sorry I wasn't able to collab with you this Black History Month. I have been like horrendously busy, and I'm sorry I let you down, but I love you. I love your work, and I know Black History Month is a time where everyone feeds the Black algorithm, but please feed the Black algorithm all the time. There are amazing creators out there, Stephanie Williams, who are just doing amazing work. Anastasia, who's been doing fun TikTok videos about Wuthering Heights, which I was following. All of my Black Game of Thrones people online who are just holding it down for Team Black. Okay, Dracarys. But anyway, let's get into it.
Somebody take me.
There's a lot of places we could begin to discuss the history of race and how it was changed by the transatlantic slave trade. But I think the easiest way and most accessible way would be to kind of co-opt Greco-Roman antiquity, especially because it's often appropriated by white supremacists on multiple fronts. as most recently seen by the anger surrounding Lupita Nyong'o being rumored to play Helen of Sparta in the upcoming Odyssey movie by Christopher Nolan. A good reference text for an overview of this subject matter would be Race and Ethnicity in the Classical World, an anthology of primary sources in translation. It takes sections of text from Antiquity and explores how it discusses foreignness and racial identity. And I might do a deeper dive on this on my Patreon next month because I do find it interesting, but it would lead to too many rabbit holes, so I just am doing the broadest overview in this particular video. The ancients would not understand the social construct we call race any more than they would understand the distinction modern scholars and social scientists generally draw between race and ethnicity. Greece and the Near East tended to posit a single source for all humans. The first humans were shaped from clay by Prometheus, and then after the destruction of the earth in a great flood, because every culture has a great flood, the next generation of humans was born of rocks thrown over the shoulders of Deucalion and Pyrrha. The races of mankind imagined by Hesiod and other Greek mythologists were generations of people born and then destroyed. They were not the origins of distinctive groups of humans. Born from the same original source, humanity somehow diverged into groups with distinctive physical characteristics. How? They don't really know, but they're going to come up with stories to explain it. One example is given in Naturalis Historia by the Roman Pliny the Elder, which covered the subjects of astronomy, geography, ethnography, anthropology, and many more. In the text, he discusses the environmental theory of how people evolved. We must add to these observations the connection to heavenly causes. It is not in doubt that the Ethiopians are burned by the heat of the sun, which is nearer to them, and are born like burned people with their beards and hair frazzled. On the opposite and icy side of the world, there are peoples with white skin and light colored hair. The latter peoples are wild because of the cold, the former lackluster because of the weather's fickleness. But in the middle of the world, there is a healthy mixture of hot and cold. Like Todoroki, the lands are fertile for all things, and the people's bodies appear moderate in size and color because of this proper mixture. We find gentle customs, clear thoughts, and temperaments open and capable of understanding all of nature. Often when people were talking about race, they were talking about lineage, and those highest up would claim to be descendants of gods.
He of the two ladies, behold Ptolemy, son of Ra, Ptolemy the divine.
We will see later as the Roman Empire expands and becomes more and more inclusive in terms of just expansion, that assimilation and cultural values becomes important to the idea of what makes someone Roman. And assimilation was varied, but those who could not assimilate or were too othered were then meant to be destroyed. We can see this in Caesar's desire to genocide the Druids, who he saw as too foreign and too threatening to properly assimilate into Roman culture. For those in the Roman establishment at this time, it was the Druids, the Germanics that were too foreign. Slavery in the time of ancient Rome was not based around the concept that we would call chattel slavery, although chattel slavery did exist in other places in the world. Chattel slavery is the process of turning people into personal property like livestock in perpetuity, meaning their children would also be property and born slaves. Slavery is something that has existed throughout the entire human history and still does exist in different ways. There are still ethnic, gender, class, and caste lines that allow it to perpetuate. People will use slavery in antiquity to attempt to soften the impact of why the transatlantic slave trade is so impactful to us in the modern day that we still talk about it and consider it very historically significant and just significant in the present day. One thing I want to say up top is that historians do discuss the ways in which slavery and empire have intersected globally. We have the evidence all around us, but it is often erased and buffed down in order to protect whatever ruling class is still in charge. And as I said before in my Wuthering Heights video, just because a conversation may be new to you does not mean it's new to historians, sociologists, or people who actually take the time to discover how these things impact society today. Roman slavery and Roman concepts of barbarity still treated certain ethnic groups as naturally inferior, and while yes, some slaves did have more rights than what we saw in modern chattel slavery, slavery in antiquity was still bad, and there were still several slave revolts because of this. There were 3 servile wars, and the most well-known being the third, led by Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus.
The true number of slave rebels is not known, but the estimates have it around being 120,000 slaves and gladiators. Now, what makes the transatlantic slave trade and how it impacted slavery important is enough to fill several scholarly books, which I have quoted in this video, but 2 things we can touch on is how it impacted empire and how it also impacted racial identity. Through the slave trade, countries in Europe were able to expand their resources out of Europe and into new territory. They didn't have to fight amongst themselves for land. There was new land to be found that they legally decided was up for grabs. Regardless of the fact that there were people there, they saw this land as being unoccupied. And so they started scavenging for it instead. It made societies that lived at the whims of European powers. European monarchs used the emerging slave trade as a way to fill their own treasuries. In The Crown Silence, a relatively new text that focuses on the English monarchy's involvement in the slave trade, it shows Elizabeth I, who is the first English monarch to invest and make profit off of the slave trade, did so during a time where she really did need the money. Contemporary estimates suggest that John Hawkins and his patrons, including Queen Elizabeth, each received a staggering 60% return on their investment. The modern day England was built off slave labor and the slave market, and that is just true of most of modern day Europe. Through this, violence against the black body is placed on a dais and becomes more than ever a fixture in having Europeans create and disseminate the concept of race and ultimately whiteness and blackness.
And where in that order should her color be placed? Above or below her Murray bloodline?
All right, shirt change. And I would just ask that you guys will ignore the fact that I had lipstick on my face during that first part. You would do it for FD signifier. So I expect the same treatment. Before we can begin to touch on the tragic mulatto, we have to have a clear understanding of where their identity is situated and why it even exists. Mixed race identity in the Americas was something new because of the fact that whiteness was trying to craft its own identity. Not only because of the fact that the mixture was becoming more and more common, but that it was happening as the mythology of race was being codified into society. Laws were being made in order to ensure that systems of power would be maintained with whiteness, Europeanness, at the top, regardless of population or proximity, especially if you have colonial outputs that will sometimes have more enslaved Africans than they would ruling white planter class. And this desire to have this kind of balancing act would largely be the difference in why certain places would have a mulatto or mixed race identity category, while in other places it would not exist. Again, the scope of this video would be way too wide if we broke down every single country and community impacted by this, because every country and community has a nuance to this. So we're just going to be broadly talking about French, Spanish, and British, Caribbean, and American slavery, just because they're really connected due to the Americas and everything like that. But please note, just because your white country was not named out does not mean you aren't responsible for stuff being mentioned here. Portugal, Belgium. France's colonial empire was the second largest after the British, and while territories would be shared and exchanged in various treaties and scrimmages, leaving evidence on all the lands that it touched. For example, my father's birth country of St. Lucia speaks a version of French patois and is very much French in its construction, but eventually became part of the British Commonwealth in some treaty at some point. And so it's British, even though it's very French. French set among the least amount of settlers to their Caribbean colonies, with Haiti being an exception to that, with the most significant population of French whites. Lestat.
He ain't white, he French.
Oh, that's a new kind of white, is it? French white?
Before the French Revolution, there were 3 groups of people. Freed white people who were either Grand Blancs or Petit Blancs, depending on their class. Freed and emancipated slaves, and enslaved people. Maroons who were runaway slaves were also part of the island structure, but they were runaways. One of the things that the French and British population structures kept in common was working to keep a freed black people, some of whom were mixed race, comfortable within the society at large. Freed black people could and did participate in owning slaves and being part of this slave system, and this was by design. True French elites were not going to be spending a lot of time on these islands, although the plantation homes they built there were often used for parties instead of symbols. But with the weather and the climate, they couldn't handle it. Therefore, by having a population of people there who could benefit from slavery that were also black, mattered. They would also allow tensions to fester between freed people of color and poor whites, the Petit Blancs, because when racism isn't enough, class warfare will be right there to help you. When it is mentioned that black people in places where chattel slavery existed and they owned slaves, this idea kind of comes up of like, well, it was okay because they were doing it too. But I think this is a way of really flattening the context of what was going on. Like, yes, black people participated in maintaining slavery, but they were not maintaining it for their own benefit and often had very few choices. They were still tools of white supremacy, and sometimes the only way that you could emancipate your family was to buy your family and then emancipate them. Spain's colonial beginnings are usually around when Henry VIII's first mother-in-law, Isabella I of Castile, funded the genocide flop known as Christopher Columbus's expedition, which led to the discovery of Hispaniola, which would become Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The genocide of native populations are a direct impact of Spain's colonial actions, while other nations of course played a role in that and would continue to do so using policies set up by the Spanish. We just need to take a moment to give them all of that smoke, considering how upset they are about tourists and immigrants. You gotta just take it in. Due to its expansion and empire, Spain and its people were having very early conversations about the morality of what was being done to the many indigenous populations after they were conquered. Isabella, shockingly, very much wrote to Christopher Columbus at one point to say, deadass, you're doing too much. Which is a lot coming from Senora Inquisition, but if she said it, you know he was fucking around. And then in 1550, hold on. I don't have a Spanish tongue, so I'm gonna I wrote down how to pronounce this properly on my little sheet here. The Valladolid debate happened. And this is true, the first Jubilee debate video, where the discussion pertained around the potential moral rights and treatment of indigenous people by European colonizers. One side argued that indigenous people were free men by nature, and even though they did weird things like human sacrifice, which we would totally never do because who would eat the body and blood of anybody? That's crazy talk. That they had a right to be treated with respect because they were inherently free men. On the other side, they said that human sacrifice and cannibalism were deal breakers, and that if people do them, we have a right to go there, suppress them for their own good. Both sides claim they won. As expansion came and intermixing also came, the concept of casta or lineage became a part of the social structure of the Spanish Empire, which was broken down into 8 divisions, which again I will refer to my notes that I wrote. So it was Español, Spaniards, which were persons of Spanish ancestry, and it was a blanket term. And that was subdivided into Peninsulars, which was a person of Spanish descent born in Spain who later came to America, or Creole, a person of Spanish descent born in the Americas. Very different. So like Bertha Mason in Jane Eyre, she would be considered a Creole because she was born in Jamaica. Castizo, a person with primarily Spanish and some American Indian ancestry, born into a mixed family. Mestizo, a person of extended Spanish and American Indian ancestry. Indio, a person of pure American Indian ancestry. Pardo, a person of mixed Spanish, American Indian, and African ancestry, sometimes a polite term for a black person. How about that? Mulatto, a person of mixed Spanish and African ancestry. Zombo, a person of mixed African and American Indian ancestry. And then at the very bottom of the pyramid, Negro, a person of African descent, primarily formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants. Wow. Black people at the bottom. Shocking. Groundbreaking. Shocking news. Spanish Empire was also bringing their own racial palette to the concept of blood purity that excluded Jewish and Muslim identities that existed in Europe. Any non-Christian blood was seen as impure, and that racism was being codified as biology. Blackness became connected to a lack of purity regardless of their faith. And so we have this combination of religious moralism being tied to race. And we can see this in the many categories that break down the lineage that have the Spanish population, and that they did mix with native and enslaved populations, and they didn't need to codify it legally, but it made it very clear that certain mixes were better and that you could slowly go up and up the trend, or lie, or pass as someone else. The British slave system and American ones are fundamentally interlinked with a few differences. We were a collection of 13 colonies plus the Caribbean before becoming the United States and several other places, regardless of the autonomy or desire of the people who lived on that land before it became part of America. So up until 1776, we are still part of the good old British slave system with King George, and after the war, the American slave system with President George. So one George to another. Laws were made in America to help slavery evolve with as little consequence to rich plantation landowners as possible, by ensuring that they would always be socially superior to Black people, freed or otherwise. And Bacon's Rebellion is part of why that was so important to have those divisions. While still under British colonial rule, the colony of Virginia was governed by a man named Sir William Berkeley. With the restoration of the monarchy, a bunch of trade issues with the Dutch, and the constant skirmishes between the native populations, there was a lot of tension between free indentured servants, new white immigrants, and other working people about what the responsibility the crown had to protect the Virginians, who were an extension of the English colonial power. After all, they're named after the Virgin Queen, Virgin Virginia. Nathaniel Bacon was the leader of this rebellion, and the goal was to change Virginia's Native American frontier policy and allow people to take over native lands. Sir William Berkeley did not want that to happen because he knew that forces were not going to be able to figure out the difference between friendly native forces, and it was diplomatically unsafe. So Bacon would organize this uprising, which was made up of Black and white people and women. It was caused a lot of turmoil until Bacon died of dysentery in October 1676, where the rebellion forces collapsed and it was totally broken. What is significant about Bacon's rebellion is that it showed a united white and Black population together against the crown, and that was not going to work for the crown. You guys had to self-govern and fight other people over there so we can use all of your resources over here, and we cannot have you do this and fight us too. Have you never played Civ 6? 7? 6, 7? I don't know, sorry. So nearly 30 years after the Virginia Slave Codes of 1706 were put into effect, there were 41 parts to this code, and all of them are equally terrible, but some of the key parts are as follows. Number 11 in the code states, no individuals such as Negroes, mulattoes, Indians, Jews, Moors, Muslims, or any other non-Christians will be allowed to purchase Christian servants. If any person from the aforementioned group purchases a Christian white servant, that servant will automatically be free. And this is why we say indigent servitude, not the same thing as slavery. Number 17 states, if a female servant has a child out of wedlock with a Negro or mulatto, in addition to completing her designated years of service, she must pay 15 pounds in current Virginia currency. This is the same case if a freed Christian white woman has a child out of wedlock with a Negro or a mulatto. Then the child will serve as servant until they reach the age of 31. 19 states that it is unlawful to intermarry between English or other white individuals and Negroes or mulattoes, especially if said English is freed. And 20 states that no minister of the Church of England or any other person within the colony and dominion is allowed to knowingly marry a white person with a mulatto or Negro or vice versa. No swirl up in here, okay? No swirl. No chocolate and vanilla. You're gonna have to just keep it separate. And so what we see beginning is that racial identity was not about lived reality and did not take into consideration how anyone would actually group themselves. Their priority was always about providing a clear racial dominance that had Western white people, specifically the English in this case, at the very top, a less fancy but still largely legally white group underneath, and then everyone else could filter in, but with African black people at the very bottom. Slavery became not only just a capitalist endeavor, but a moral calling on behalf of civilized Christian society onto the savages. As a result, whiteness had to be maintained, with each colonial superpower doing that in different ways. For the British, it was by having their middle black race category, a mixed or colored identity, that allowed for the fact that there would be mixing, but that they would be a more privileged group than black people, but could never become white. So you could be better off than other blacks, but you could never be white, no matter how mixed you were. But of course, why did North America differ from even that in terms of how things were happening in England? And the reality is because white people were in America. The climate in the Caribbean was too much for the average white person and they would get sick, and so it wasn't really habitable for a lot of them. But they still needed to have a class of people there who were able to help secure that territory, especially in terms of naval warfare. In Jamaica, British colonists spent decades attempting to subdue the Maroons, free descendants of formerly enslaved Africans who had fled their plantations and established sovereign communities in their island's mountainous interior. After a peace treaty signed in 1739, the Jamaican government recognized the Maroons' autonomy and land rights. In exchange, the Maroons pledged to return runaways and provide marital assistance during slave revolts and foreign invasions. So basically, in return for a lack of racial solidarity, they would give them autonomy. They lacked sufficient white men, so they needed this class division to happen. But it didn't stop slave revolts, and especially Tacky's revolt, which I'm going to try not to go down too many history rabbit holes, but it astounds me that Tacky's revolt is not global knowledge. It is considered to be one of the most significant slave rebellions during this time, and a big imperial fuck you to the British. And yes, it was subjugated, but it proves something that I think we don't often get reminded of. None of us in the diaspora took to slavery without fighting back. We have constantly been fighting for our independence, for our right to begin, even if it was against people who looked like us. We all knew that there was an importance in fighting our oppressors, even if we died in the process. Anyway, this is why we have these mixing identities as part of France and colonial identity, and even British. But again, with North America, because especially post the revolution, there was an incentive to keep the slave trade moving in a direction that was profitable because of capitalism. That means abusing workers. Cotton was not initially thought to be profitable in America, and when it was, that meant bringing in more enslaved people to do that labor. And when you were pushing them in these ungodly ways, it needs you to make them be a permanent subjugated class. And during the revolutionary upheavals of the 18th century, planters and slaves moved back and forth between the West Indies and North America, bringing with them further knowledge about cotton planting. In 1788, for example, the owners of a slave from St. Croix advertised him for sale in the United States as well acquainted with the culture of cotton. The slave cotton paradigm invented in the West Indies now spread to the American mainland. In the 1790s, the slave population of the state of Georgia nearly doubled to 60,000. In South Carolina, the number of slaves in the upcountry cotton growing districts grew from 21,000 in 1790 to 70,000 20 years later, including 15,000 slaves newly brought from Africa. It's sometimes really disturbing to think that even though we, descendants of chattel slavery in the Americas, have been here building communities for literally hundreds of years, that even so close to recent history, 15,000 slaves from Africa were being brought into the United States in order to feed this cotton empire, that there has just been no relief. And Even though I know this as someone who studies this topic, it's still very sobering to remind myself that, you know, we can put a number on it, but there is no number. It exists in perpetuity. In just the game of numbers, this is a threat. And anything that blurs the color line is even more of a threat. Even when the reason for that blurring is the and assault of Black enslaved women.
We interrupt this program.
While I didn't find Wuthering Heights particularly sexy or transgressive, one thing it did make me contemplate is what becomes transgressive. As someone who has always been top heavy, I have been very aware of how certain body parts become hypersexualized. The body is political, and so are certain body parts, which is why I've been enjoying my friend Tara's Nebula series, Politits. It's all about breasts. The fascination with them, how they became sexy, and how they can be politicized on both sides of the aisle. I didn't do so in this particular video, but I have been doing my part of showing progressive girl cleavage as much as possible. I'm doing my part. Politits is currently streaming exclusively on Nebula, and a new episode has just been released talking about another body part that I just can't get enough of. But Nebula has over 200 creators now with early and exclusive content, including myself, so you will find something you love to watch. Or you can use my link down below or the QR code on screen, and you will be supporting me and other creators that make work that's actually too radical for YouTube while enjoying an exclusive 50% off an annual subscription, which comes down to $2.50 a month. Which will come in handy when everyone needs to watch the next FD signifier video, because I never tried to watch that Tyler Perry the first time and it got taken down. Not me. I didn't have that problem. Got it right the first time on Nebula. All Boondocks references intact. There is also a new South Park exclusive from Lindsay Ellis, so you know it's good. So what are you waiting for? Go on that Nebula, girl.
Is it me dress you like, or me pretty fair face that make you both stare so?
The mule, a hybrid between two species of equine, a horse and a donkey, with the mother being a mare, horse, and the father being a jack, donkey. The mule was born domesticated. It is hardier and can live longer than a horse, and they are less stubborn while being more intelligent than donkeys. Mules are made to perform labor. What makes the mule interesting from an evolutionary perspective is that they are seen as an improved version of their parent. As Charles Darwin once said, "The mule always appears to me a most surprising animal, that a hybrid should possess more reason, memory, obstinacy, social affection, powers of muscular endurance, and length of life than either of its parents seems to indicate that art has here outdone nature." Mules are often infertile because despite having a common ancestor in their evolution, they are two different species with different chromosomes, so the entire animal has to be bred to exist. It's why, like, people are like, why don't they breed a tiger and a lion? It's like, because they're not. Ligers are abominations and in pain. It is from the word mule that we get the word mulatto, referring usually to a mixture between a white person and an African black person. The etymology behind the word is enough, but I find the mixture to be just as telling. A mule is part horse and part donkey. We do not view those two animals the same way. Horses are these symbols of vigor, masculinity, these wild, untamed forces, but also a symbol of wealth, power, and a civilizing force. The donkey...
Say no more, you don't have to worry about a thing. I will always be here to make sure nobody bothers you. Donkey.
Which one do you think the white person is in this mulatto equivalent? It attempts to imply that white people and black people are different species at their core that share a common ancestor, which is untrue, and the reason why the mulatto will become a symbol of the ills of slavery for many people. One of the rules that was made up in the advent of slavery was the expectation that the legal status of the child was defined by the mother's status. If the mother was enslaved, then the child would be as well. This became law in Virginia initially and then spread to the other 13 colonies. The reason for this is usually connected to the case of Elizabeth Key Grinstead. Elizabeth Key is the first black woman to sue for her freedom and win. Her case was built on two significant merits. One, that her father was a white Englishman, and the fact that her father sent her to be an indentured servant under a guardianship that was supposed to end after, I believe, 15 years. Her common law husband was a white man and a lawyer and helped her sue successfully to gain freedom for herself and her son. And Virginia said, that's not happening again. In December of 1662, the Virginia House of Burgess codified the above Latin. This all allowed white men to have no legal responsibility to claim or acknowledge their children born of or consensual black relationships. Of course, if there was a light-skinned face on the plantation, there would be little debate as to whom the father was. This also creates a division between freed black people and enslaved black people, because now you can't marry someone who exists in that different legal status. It further dehumanizes black men and women from each other in the marital tradition and in a familial sense. It also places black women specifically in a position where their wombs are very political, and who they choose to marry as freed black women becomes so politically significant. While it's kind of hard to imagine right now, the mulatto was a dangerous figure in the minds of white supremacist society. Not only did their appearance, for all of the colorism it encapsulated, prove that black people and white people were not two different creatures, but the fact that they were seen as attractive and could be educated meant that racial science was fundamentally wrong. Obviously. Of course, they wouldn't really acknowledge that and simply pretended that it was their white blood that made these children so talented. Still, two different social issues arose. One, if the child of a slave could be so light and so fair in phenotype that they could pass for a white person, then it meant that they could be a secret Negro anywhere. Mixed race people were therefore viewed as sneaky. Two, even among those who may have agreed with slavery or were neutral on the status of abolition, could still be appalled by the fact that these white men, mostly white men, were enslaved women and having children with them that would also be enslaved. That there is no moral reasoning for that. Even if you victim blame black women, which many people did, it did not erase the fact that these children existed and under the laws of slavery were subjected to the whip, the auction block, and all the violences included with that, and that fathers were willingly doing this to their children. How can you sell your children? How can you enact violence upon the bodies of women without any consequences, especially when the body of a woman is used symbolically to be the reason why men do what they do? The existence of mixed race persons complicated the establishment of race that was literally put into place to defend slavery. However, in America, specifically the continental United States, this was especially complicated by the fact that mixed race people were not their own group. Other slave cultures had multiple races, mixes, and legal and social statuses for different ethnic groups, as we explored earlier. America is unique in that it very much wanted and needed to protect its white population. White people came to America by choice, largely. Yes, there were indentured servants. Yes, there were people fleeing religious persecution. Shout out to my girl Ann Lee. But there were also people who were trying to build up plantations and use this land in order to create their own societies. That, as well as conflicts with indigenous groups and the fact that often slave populations outsized their slave owners, it was important that there be no unity between black people and other groups, because that would tip the scales too much. Enter the tragic mulatto. In U.S. fictions, the tragic mulatto mulatta is normally characterized as a mixed race figure who finds him or herself depressed, suicidal, fratricidal, and or patricidal due to either a lack of identity or to an innate biological corruption. According to the stereotype, these individuals do not know whether they fit into white society or into black society, and are often made to choose between their dual identities, passing either into whiteness, the most familiar trope, or into blackness. A salient example of this choice occurs in Frances E.W. Harper's Iola Leroy, or Shadows Uplifted, one of my favorite books. Those characters who choose whiteness, even summarily so, are normally punished with death or worse, as in Wells Brown's Clotel or The President's Daughter, while those who choose blackness are usually praised and esteemed, as in Iola Leroy. Other figurations of the tragic mulatto, mulatta presents characters as sexually depraved, weaklings, or even homosexuals, as in William Faulkner's Light in August and Absalom, inevitably returning to the idea that they were somehow degenerate, corrupt, and therefore tragic because of their mixed race. While this is a figure most notable in fiction that takes place in the United States, there are elements of it around the world wherever chattel slavery took place. But it is most significant here because, again, we don't have the mixed race liminal identity. This is also why the one-drop rule would come into place in how blackness was identified legally by white people. The one-drop rule is also one of those terms that has been heavily flattened by online spaces. Part of the issue is that these rules and standards were not invented or based on the realities of black people and how they classified themselves. When they say one drop, they're not talking about someone with one black parent or one black grandparent. They are talking about, in some of the most extreme cases, someone who is 1/16 black. The one-drop rule exists for one reason and one reason only: to keep black people out of white spaces, to ensure that there is no possibility of someone secretly having a Desiree's Baby. Desiree's Baby is an 1893 short story by the American writer Kate Chopin. It takes place in the antebellum period of Louisiana and is about a French Creole woman named Desiree, who was adopted and ends up marrying into another wealthy French Creole family. She gives birth to a baby who is the same color as that of a quadroon. Everyone decides that Desiree must be part black, and her husband, Armand, makes her leave and he burns all hers and the baby's stuff. In a bundle of letters that is not burned from his own parents, this is revealed. It was part of an old letter from his mother to his father. He read it. She was thanking God for the blessing of her husband's love. But above all, she wrote, "Night and day, I thank the good God for having so arranged our lives that our dear Armand will never know that his mother, who adores him, belongs to the race that is cursed with the brand of slavery."
Surprise, motherfucker.
Also, the baby's name is Xandrine. We gotta bring that back. Some of these names, I'm like, oh yes, that is ancestrally blessed. Xandrine? The story, which was originally published in Vogue, speaks of the illusion of white supremacy, especially in a place like New Orleans, which even among the United States has a very different feel to it because it was owned by the French for such a long period of time. It has different laws, a whole different flavor to it. It's very, very unique, as anyone who is from there can tell you. What Desiree's Baby illustrates is how the identity of mixed race characters could be used as cautionary tales about the evils of slavery or the trickiness of Negroes, depending on who was holding the pen. In that regard, the tragic mulatto or tragic mulatta became one of the first identity politics, both in regards to who wrote the stories and the kind of stories that would be told. From my research, the first tragic mulatto story in English was by the abolitionist Linda Marie Child, called The Quadroons, published in 1842. One of the most uncomfortable things about doing research about this topic is realizing how problematic a lot of these abolitionist works were. The Quadroon is about a white passing woman named Rosalie who is married to a white man named Edward. They have a daughter together named Zarifa, but when Edward decides to pivot back to whiteness, he leaves Rosalie and his daughter to marry a white woman. Rosalie dies of heartbreak after refusing to be Edward's mistress, and I gotta tell you, it was using all of my energy not to edit this whole portion using Twilight clips. Zarifa then is put into the care of a teacher that her father assigned for her. Edward becomes a drunk after Rosalie dies, and he gets into a drunk horse riding accident and dies. He leaves behind no will, and his white wife does not give a fuck about Zarifa. And because Edward never emancipated her, Zarifa is sold into slavery. Zarifa did fall in love with her white harp teacher, George, and they were going to run away together, but he got shot.
Wouldn't let that shit happen to me, though.
Zarifa is sold into slavery, and then she takes her own life. This is the classic tragic mulatto recipe of the antebellum period, and it works perfectly because it touches on the things that are meant to stoke the lowercase r romance of the entire situation. A genuine love match that cannot be, tragic circumstances, secret identities, and also a woman dying after failing to preserve her dignity. They're all very white romantic archetypes that are now put onto these light, bright, but still ancestry black characters. Zarifa, again, excellent name, is a character who would essentially be an octoroon or 1/8 black. So they would look like an even whiter Haley Steinfeld.
Boy, if you don't get the fuck out my face.
The unspoken reality is that they are saying, look how white this woman is. And she's still treated this way. This could be you. How do you know you're white? William Wells Brown wrote Clotel in 1853, a novel significant for a number of reasons. It is considered to be the first novel written and published by an African American, and it discussed the rumor that Thomas Jefferson fathered children with Sally Hemings, who was not only enslaved by Jefferson, but was Jefferson's dead wife's half-sister and the same age as his own eldest daughter. Hemings is not named in the book and is instead fictionalized as a woman named Currier. Currier has 2 daughters with Jefferson, Clotel and Althesa. When Jefferson dies, all 3 are sold into slavery. Clotel is married by a white man who takes her as his common law wife. The other 2 are left in slavery, with Currier dying from yellow fever, and Althesa eventually passes as white to marry her own white master, Henry Morton. Morton does not emancipate any of them, and after Morton and Althesa dies, guess what happens to their daughter? Following the plot of The Quadroon, eventually Clotel's white man leaves her for a white woman, and she is sold into slavery along with their majority white child. Clotel is eventually taken to the slave market in DC and escapes slave catchers and decides to jump into the Potomac River. Thus died Clotel, the daughter of Thomas Jefferson, a president of the United States. Brown, Frederick Douglass, with whom he had beef with because the ancestors do be scrapping, it's hilarious. Harriet E. Wilson, Frank J. Webb, who was the grandson of Aaron Burr Sir, all used their mixed race identity as a way to discuss the sexual trauma of slavery, the identity issues that came with the social politics of that identity, and to try and get readers who were white to understand how blurry the lines between white and black were going to be during slavery and with the violence against enslaved women. But it also illustrates that, broadly, the tragic mulatto was not created to reflect the realities of complex mixed race identity for black people. These were for white audiences at the time and remained so overwhelmingly, and it would continue to be a way that white writers would try and explore this topic for white people, most famously put together and encapsulated in Uncle Tom's Cabin. In Never Was Born, The Mulatto, an American Tragedy by Werner Solers, he explicitly ties the tragic mulatto to Greek tragedy. Many interpretations of the mulatto tradition have emphasized the supposed flattery to whites that the text embodied, and which some of Howell's language reflects. The 20th century critic and poet Sterling Brown, who also helped establish and define the term tragic mulatto, gave the following often cited definition. The problem of miscegenation, generally stated romantically, was stressed above all other problems which were of greater moment to the Negro. The chief reason for this should be fairly obvious. The audience was readier to sympathize with heroes and heroines nearer to themselves in appearance. The superiority wished upon the octoroons was easily attributed to the white blood coursing in their veins, and the white audience was thereby flattered. On the other hand, that unfailingly tragic outcome supported the belief that mixture of the races was a curse. Problems such as segregation, exploitation, and other denials of democracy, all uncomfortable theater fare, were shelved, whereas perplexities of a handful of fair mulattoes were misconceived and exaggerated beyond recognition. As we get through emancipation and into Reconstruction, there are new political and legal goals for the color line. Now that black people were no longer enslaved, but their labor was still important, it became necessary to legally enforce that. Daniel Brook explains in Accidents of Color that many southern states following the Civil War attempted to institute black codes that would essentially continue slavery under a different name. Louisiana Democrats' official platform demanded a government of white people, made and to be perpetuated for the exclusive political benefit of the white race, and in accordance with the constant adjudication of the United States Supreme Court that the people of African descent cannot be considered as citizens of the United States, and that there can in no event nor under any circumstances be any equality between the whites and other races. Hoping to keep freedmen tied to the land despite emancipation, the new legislature passed a black code in all but name, which required plantation laborers to sign year-long labor contracts each winter, presumably to farm the same land they had worked as slaves for the very families that had owned them. Those who remained unemployed after the contracting period could be arrested for vagrancy, whipped, and sold into bonded labor when found in towns they did not live in, i.e., conducting a job search. And by maintaining the color line, began an attempt to make people legally black. Being legally black builds off the one-drop rule, which again was for white people and was not about black identity at all. Beyond erecting these demeaning and debilitating borders around African American life in South Carolina, the code explicitly defined the borders of blackness. For the first time in the history of South Carolina, blackness was given a biological definition, and under it, most brown South Carolinians became officially black. According to the new race code, anyone with more than 1/8 African ancestry was legally black. This new law overrode the 1835 state Supreme Court decision that had treated whiteness in South Carolina as a fungible class status rather than a biological fact. Under that decision, a free high-status Carolinian could be legally white no matter his or her complexion or ancestry. Now the antebellum freed people of color, nearly all of whom had at least one great-grandparent of African descent, were legally black no matter how light their skin, how large their bank account, and how prominent their white relatives. This is a reminder that race math and even terms like monoracial are a part of this kind of race science. It doesn't actually account for lived reality, phenotype, culture, and simply dilutes all of that into a number that is based off of wonky science, which forces people within their community to pick a side, and again is not really indicative of anything having to do with lived black reality. This is when the tragic mulatto transforms from a figure of antebellum tragedy to a modern-day threat under passing. Passing is another one of those terms that has been co-opted. There is a difference between someone who can pass and someone who is passing. For example, Halsey. Halsey has a white mother and a black father. Yes, I found the picture. He is a black man. She is biracial, but because of her phenotype, she could pass for white. However, Halsey has never denied her heritage. She presents as white. That's a difference, and we know that biracial people look very different. Naya Rivera, rest in peace, was Afro-Latina. She looked like this. Her brother looks like this. Genetics are weird. And also, we can understand that there's a difference between genetics, your ancestry, and then also social implications of that, like colorism. Having 4 black parents does not escape you from having colorist ideology, because if all 4 of your grandparents are light brights, passing means actively severing those ties, and there is no going back from that. That is what makes passing so severe. To pass as white was to make an anxious decision to turn one's back on a black racial identity and to claim to belong to a group to which one was not legally assigned. It was risky business. In today's multiracial society, the decision to pass may seem foolish, frivolous, or disloyal. It may be reminiscent of an unexpected plot twist in a novel or film. Or it may be understood as a desperate act compelled by the racial constraints of the bygone era of segregation and racial violence. Once one circumvented the law, fooled co-workers, deceived neighbors, tricked friends, and sometimes even duped children and spouses, there were enormous costs to pay. The most famous mainstream non-black written narrative about passing is probably The Imitation of Life. It was originally a book by Fannie Hurst that was made into a movie twice, once in 1934 starring Claudette Colbert, and then in 1959 starring Lana Turner. The story talks about the relationship between a woman and her maid, and the maid's daughter who is passing for white.
Well, he's white, and if he ever finds out about me, I'll kill myself.
But why?
Because I'm white too. And if I have to be colored, then I want to die.
Sarah Jane, what are you saying?
I want to have a chance in life. I don't want to have to come through back doors or feel lower than other people or apologize for my mother's color.
Don't say that.
She can't help her color. But I can.
I do think that works like The Imitation of Life are narratively incomplete because, again, they are written kind of for white people, which is why I'm thankful for Nella Lawson's passing. Nella Lawson has a very unique space within the Harlem Renaissance. She herself was mixed race, but her mixed race father was from the Danish West Indies. And as a result, when her father left, she grew up being raised by her white mother, who herself was a Danish immigrant. Larson grew up in Chicago, but was born before the Great Migration actually happened. Larson did not grow up in community with black people. It wasn't until she went to Fisk University that Larson got to explore her blackness and all the ways in which she didn't grow up understanding it, like growing up in the black church and things like that. For her, the novel Passing isn't about the desire to become white, it is about the loss of blackness. The two characters in Passing are two childhood friends named Claire Kendry and Irene Redfield. Claire attempts to pass for white and is married to a racist where Irene could pass, but chooses not to. The story is about them reconnecting at the Drayton Hotel in Chicago and Claire attempting to rejoin black society as a friendly outsider.
Things aren't always what they seem, Hugh. Nobody could tell from looking at her.
No. Most surprising. Tell me, can you always tell the difference?
Very similar in a sense to Mary from Ryan Coogler's Sinners. Mary in the film, like the actress Hallie Steinfeld, is of mixed race ancestry. Mary grew up in community with the black people in the Delta. However, at the insistence of Stack, she ends up going to pass for white and getting married to a white man in Arkansas.
Oh, that shit was your idea. I didn't want no white man. I didn't want to be white. I wanted to be with you.
Similar to Claire in Passing, what Mary does that damns her, and everyone else to an extent, is trying to have it both ways. That is not me saying I think Mary is a villain in Sinners. Please don't put that on me.
How'd she get in?
And that is none here, because she family.
That's not what I think. But it does speak to the way in which a black pen in the present day crafting this narrative is so different. Mary coming back to her mother's funeral is her biggest mistake, and it shows that she doesn't really have it in her to pass. She comes back, and you're not supposed to. You can't. She looked white, as did both her parents. At the insistence of her mother, she would move far away from Chicago's South Side to Los Angeles to live the rest of her life as a white woman apart from her family. It was not a choice. She pleaded with her mother. She didn't want to leave her family, her friends, and the only life she had ever known. But her mother was determined, and the matter was decided. Years later, after she married a white man and raised white children who knew nothing of her past, she received an inconvenient telephone call. It was her mother, and she called to tell her that her father was dying, and she must come home immediately. Despite these dire circumstances, she would never return to Chicago's South Side.
I want to go away. Go away? Go where, Viola? By that I mean, I want to go away. And you mustn't see me, or own me, or claim me, or anything. Even if you pass me on the street, you'll have to pass me by.
Oh, no, Viola.
Oh, I know it's terrible of me, Miss B. But you don't know what it is to look white and be black.
Claire also doesn't have that in her. She's living a lie. She's living in a state of constant racial anxiety. That's why as soon as she reunites to Irene, she almost becomes like a parasite because she just refuses to resever those ties. And when she is caught by her husband and commits suicide, well, it's unclear, but I would say she commits suicide. Her death is labeled death by misadventure because she chose this path. And it makes it seem as though she had a lot more choice than I think is actually in the text itself. And I think it speaks to why more recent narratives about passing written by black people and black mixed race people is a lot more intricate than the tragic mulatto stock character. As just a stock character, the tragic mulatto flattens the complicated reality of what it means to be mixed race in this country or across the world, especially in the context of how these characters came to be, which is largely through. It presents mixed race identity in the state of melodrama, and I think because of that, it creates the idea that to be mixed race is to be lost. The trope in of itself represents a colorist idea as well. The idea that the only way to give black people humanity in the eyes of white people is to make them either as close to white as possible, either through sexual suffering or emotional suffering. And this is why I think there have been so many jokes about this, especially with the Loving v. Virginia as being a bit of a joke in the black online space, because there is a category of black people who make their white partners their entire personality, so much so that even me, a swirler, can get a little Dr. Umar about it. And I'm not anti mixed race couples, okay? I love Cloak and Dagger.
We are Cloak and Dagger. We are hope and fear.
But I think it does a disservice to how radical Loving v. Virginia was in terms of reversing centuries of laws that made black women suffer sexual violence and only seen as mistresses to white men. The fact that people will still use the term bedwench just speaks to how ignorant people are about the ways in which black women have always had to navigate sexual violence. And regardless of how you feel about interracial marriage, and like there's a lot to be said about how cringe some people make it, the fact that it was illegal is inherently a white supremacist tactic. But now, decades later, we carry the inheritance of all of this, and it leads back to a conversation that I think the tragic mulatto is a part of, even if it's not the center of it. Who is black? And what does it mean to be black? And quite frankly, I blame Rachel Dolezal for a lot of this conversation, because for a long time, we knew that, yes, there are some people who are very light-skinned and they may be part of our community. And then she came along and fucked it up for every light-skinned bitch with freckles. And so now we have to deal with all this bullshit. They always plotting. So even though I'm speaking with this with a level of nuance and care towards this identity, please let it be known. I have 4 black parents. I have a dark-skinned black mother. I'm good. In passing, Irene alludes to the court case Rylander v. Rylander. I did a longer video about this a few years ago that I know no one saw, but if you want all the details of the case, and I do think it's interesting, you can check it out here. Essentially, Leonard Kip Rylander, an American socialite and member of the New York elite, like Revolutionary War elite, married a woman named Alice Jones, a biracial woman who was a working class daughter of English immigrants. She was slightly older than Kip as well. Kip's family wanted them to divorce because even though at the time interracial marriage was legal in New York, it was also very rare. The whole thing was very shameful, and so Kip sued for a divorce, claiming that Alice lied about her race. Alice was made to, before an all-white male jury, take off her clothes to show her naked body in order to prove that Kip would have known that she was not white, since they did have a sexual relationship. Even if she had no ancestry that tied her to an African past, she was black in the eyes of most who read or heard about the deliberations in the Westchester County Court. In 1925, after all, men and women still lived who had inspected others for profit on auction blocks, or had themselves been so inspected. The common thread: black bodies, no matter how fair, could be identified on review, which marked those people as different, and white treatment of them as appropriate. That was at least the logic that governed American race relations for centuries, and made Alice Beatrice Jones Rylander forever colored. Alice was neither the first nor the last African American woman axed or forced to bare her body to satisfy the needs and curiosities of white men. In an insidious fashion, the viewing of Alice's body, the fact that she didn't speak, the extent to which others redramatized the moment, truly objectified Alice and made her an item to be viewed and desired. In effect, the display of Alice became pornographic. I find this case deeply fascinating, and I have since I first did that video and found out about it, because it illustrates something that's very important about the social construction of race. It is highly visible and assumptive based on phenotype. Recently online, there has been a lot of discussion about who gets to be black, who claims black identity, what does black identity mean, where do biracial people, mixed race people, and people who have different ideas of their identity from other parts of the world in the diaspora fit into Black American society. I'm not gonna get into all of the lettered group dynamics because I don't like diaspora wars and diaspora conflict. I do prefer to view things from a historical perspective and take into account sociology, even though I'm not a sociologist in training. There's a great Black American sociologist who talks about these issues. I will link her down below. And again, you have Julius for Harriet, a lot of people who talk about this that are Black Americans. I'm American Black. That is different. I acknowledge that. And while I definitely feel adjacent to these issues, I recognize that I am not a part of that community in that way. And I think it's very clear to see that there's a lot of ignorance that is being dealt with by people who, quite frankly, are so uneducated in this issue that if it wasn't that they cause so much drama and discussion, I would find it laughable that they even get platforms. Because I think anyone who can sit up and say that Black Americans don't have culture is either a racist, a troll, or only woke up 5 minutes ago. Because that just doesn't make any sense. Black Americans' impact is global, but despite that, history and propaganda does a lot of work to both appropriate and proliferate Black American cultural impact, but stripping it of any cultural context. Additionally, America and many other colonial superpowers still rely on the labor of immigrants, Black and otherwise, especially of nations they continue to destabilize, something that we are being actively reminded of right now. We are also very undereducated in Black cultures outside of wherever we are at large, especially in places like Latin America, where so many descendants of chattel slavery exist but are culturally whitewashed or erased as part of that conversation. Afro-Latino is not a new identity because we have plenty of evidence of historical people who identified it in a kind of Afro-Latino way, but we are seeing resurgence of this, and part of that has to do with education. And I think what's really important to understand, and I say this as a child of immigrants, is that I am like a first generation Afro-Caribbean person. That's how people would want me to identify, right? I know more about African Caribbean history than my parents do, because I have had the privilege to take time and the intellectual and the fascination with it. You know, part of why I think I am part of the Pan-African woo-woo is part of because I do see these connections, and studying history and is what makes me proud of being Black. You know, I don't really identify the way people traditionally would like me to, because just throughout my experience of learning about the transatlantic slave trade, how interwoven it all is, it leads me to believe, and this is off the cuff, so I apologize if it's kind of messy, I personally identify as like, I'm Black first, and I am a descendant of chattel slavery. That is in the Americas. Like, you know, that is much more important to me in terms of how I view my cultural landscape than necessarily that my mother is from Jamaica and my father is from St. Lucia. And I'm sure they probably would not love that. But it's not because I'm not proud of those things. I'm proud of that heritage. But to me, nationalism is a disease. It really is. Because here's what the facts are for me, is that my reality of the reality of my people as descendants of slavery is older than any of these countries. It's older than the United States, older than Canada, older than, Jamaica, St. Lucia. What we share as a cultural historical event, as a cultural historical trauma, is older than any of these nations. And so that to me is more ethnically relevant and more historically and heritagely relevant to me than whatever island that some of my family is from. Because the reality is that, like, I live in New York now, identifies me from Brooklyn more than anything else, honestly. But, like, there's a place called Weeksville that is a freed Black society. That's my last name. And there has always been a global effort to get us to communicate less. There's this great book called The Common Wind. And one of the things that white slave owners were always kind of asking themselves was like, how do these guys always know what's going on? How do they know in South Carolina what's happening in Haiti? What's happening in Cuba? How do they know all of this? Who's telling them this? We've always been talking. We've always been communicating. We've always found ways to communicate through our songs, our dances, our styles. We have maintained a connectivity over centuries of them trying to beat that out of us. Centuries, right? And to see the divisions try to be co-opted into whiteness if not by color, but by mindset, is frustrating. But when we do communicate, it tends to, at least in the internet age, be a lot of low quality conversation that breeds resentment and passes along incomplete sociological realities to each other. At the risk of sounding elitist, I will say that a lot of people are getting their information from people who are not as educated on the topic as they may seem to be, or they're getting information from someone who has only just started the process of learning. At this point in my life, I've been actively studying and learning about slavery, the diaspora, its intersections for almost 10 years. And that's even in a higher academic setting because I have a master's degree. I could have a PhD if I wanted to. Amongst those 10 years of education and listening that have made me the most racially secure in the face of very frustrating realities, in the face of active erasure of the contributions of Black Americans to this country and other Black immigrants to not just this country, but to other Black people, that we have had a connective desire to see each other free that is being diluted by these capitalistic constraints that we put into, and the way in which we are not able to fully communicate frustrations amongst each other. One of the great things about reading kind of like socialist books from across the diaspora is like, oh, unfortunately that class of like Black literati has always cooked. But they're so accessible. Like you read Amit Cesar, and you read Fanon, and you read Du Bois, and you read everybody. You're like, you'll just be like, this is so good. But again, it's all about communication and having leadership that understands the power of global Black strongholds. There's a reason why Patrice Lumumba is not with us. The Belgian government was complicit in his assassination. And there's a reason why that was felt over the world. When Malcolm X died, felt all over the world. Martin Luther King all over the world. Nelson Mandela felt all over the world. We understand that there is a existing colonial fight that we're still fighting. And unfortunately, some people are ops. When Kendrick said snitch DNA, it's real. It's real. And so what we are always fighting is this way in which Black identity is something that we feel in our bones, and we are constantly trying to deal with that and what it means to be Black in a society that wants to segregate us continually. And that in America, which is so unique in how it is constructed racially, and the racial divides that it festers and fosters, that it becomes sometimes hard to communicate with people who we should have easy communication with. And I think that is a huge flaw in the system, because the system, oppression is up. The system is invested in anti-Blackness, is invested in treating the Black American as a subgroup, as a lower caste, and making everyone think that they can just get slightly ahead by being on top of that. And growing up in America, being raised among Black Americans, being raised in a true understanding of Black American history will knock that out of you real quick. But if you choose not to be educated and you choose to move in ignorance and pass it along, you become a liability. And there are a lot of liabilities walking around, talking around, co-opting the frustrations and the valid concerns that we have as a society and using it to get a dollar out of your frustration. And I say this, there's a lot of work to be done. There is a lot of work to be done. But many people are only invested in the anger and not in reconciliation. Having Black ancestry is one thing, but I think being Black politically is its own thing. And I think, while of course ancestry matters, and again, I have the Black ancestry to back up everything, but I do feel entirely that is politics and how you navigate situations that really show if you are pro-Black or not. Again, when we are dealing with issues of colorism, it doesn't matter how many Black grandparents you have. Colorism is not about your DNA. It is about how you appear and navigate through the world. We also understand that up until very recently, people did not get to make choices. Eartha Kitt did not choose to be mixed race. Her mother did not choose to have a child with a white man. She was the victim of Eartha Kitt also tried to date black men and wanted to be with black men, but they did not want to be with her for their own political reasons, and she did end up having a child with a white man, and that child presents very white. And while she would not be a representation of the average black woman, nor do I think that she would want to be, she is a part of the historical tapestry that black people experienced in this country and in other parts of the diaspora. And yes, it can be complicated when people want to use certain terms that we personally don't care for here, and then everyone's fighting about it, and rather than having a conversation, a bunch of bots want to come and just make things really uncomfortable for everyone involved. For me, the black people that I want to be in community with are the people who believe in progressive black policies for all black people, who are pro-black to the people that they love and the people they hate. Because the reality is that you cannot have black liberation if every tweet is going to push you into white supremacy. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. So glad I finally got to get it out to you guys. And I'm just eternally happy and grateful to be young-ish, gifted, and black.
Robert Elliott was part African-American.
I knew it. I knew it. Thank you, God.